Fun fact, the US discards around 11 million tons of textiles every single year. And ever since I learned that fact, I've made it my mission to teach people how to upcycle existing textiles into wearable garments. If you're interested in sewing and keeping precious resources out of the landfill, follow along for this towel shorts tutorial. You can start by printing out the pattern that's on my website in your preferred size, tape all of the sheets of paper together, and then cut it out. Next, you're going to take your towel and lay it out, and I recommend utilizing the finished edge on one of the four sides of the towels. It will make the process easier later on. I'm using old tiles to weigh down the pattern so that it stays in place. You can also use pins or a book or really anything that you have lying around. Once you've cut everything out, you should have two or one pocket, two mirror images of the front panel, and two mirror images of the back panels. And you can tell it's the back panel because the crotch is slightly longer. Next, we're going to finish the edges of all four sides of your pocket. You can do this using a serger like I am here, or just using a zigzag stitch on your sewing machine. We're also going to finish the crotch seam and the hip seam on all four panels, so on both front panels and both back panels. And this is what your panel should look like once you've finished all of those edges. Next, we're going to pin the top edge of the pocket down by about a 1/2 inch, and then you're going to sew it down roughly 1/2 inch from the edge. Once you've sewn that down, you're going to press the other three sides of the pocket by about 1/4 to a 1/2 inch, doesn't really matter, and then clip your corners to reduce the bulk on that pocket. We're going to pin the pocket onto your preferred panel. I'm using the back left panel because that's where I wanted my pocket to go. Make sure you're properly tucking under that pressed edge, and the more pins you can use here, the flatter your pocket will lay, and it'll just be a lot easier to sew it onto the panel. Now you're going to top stitch the pocket onto the panel. Make sure to reinforce those top corners. That's where most of the pocket gets strained when you're putting things in and out of your pocket. Once you've sewn on your pocket, take your back left panel and lay the front left panel on top of it, right sides together, and we're going to sew down this crotch seam with about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once you sew down the crotch seam, you're going to serge it, and then you're going to repeat those same steps for the right front panel and the right back panel. After you finish that crotch seam, you're going to serge the bottom edge of both legs, and then you're going to hem it by turning it up by about a 1/2 inch. One thing to keep in mind as you're hemming it is once you get to that crotch seam, you're basically sewing through 4 layers of towel, so it's quite bulky. I recommend manually cranking it through to make sure you don't break a needle. Also, who else holds way too many pins in their mouth while they're sewing? Once you've hemmed both sides, you're going to take both legs and you're going to lay them on top of each other with right sides together. And you're going to pin all along that U-shaped curve, making sure that that crotch seam is lined up on both sides. Once you've finished pinning, you're going to sew along that curve by roughly a 1/2 inch seam allowance once again. And now you're going to open up your pattern pieces and you're going to lay the front on top of the back with right sides together. We're going to sew along both hip seams. Once you finish those hip seams, now it's time to do the waistband casing. So using a 1.25 inch measurement, you're going to fold down the top edge of the waistband and pin it right on that 1.25 measurement. Make sure you measure every couple of inches to ensure that you're keeping a consistent distance from the edge. And also make sure that you open up those seams like on the hip and the crotch so that it's not super bulky on those seams. Once you finish pinning, you're going to sew all the way around that edge, leaving a 1 inch gap so that we can insert the elastic after the fact. Now, take your elastic and get a safety pin and put the safety pin on the edge of your elastic. We're going to feed the elastic through the casing that you just sewed. The way I like to do this is you can insert the head of that safety pin into that little 1-inch gap, gather a bunch of the fabric onto the head of the safety pin, and then pull the safety pin through using your left hand. This is a little bit tedious, and because the fabric is so thick, you might have to wrestle with it a little bit, but stick with it. Make sure you also don't lose the other end of that elastic as you're pulling it through. You need both ends to be available so that we can sew them together at the end. Once the elastic is through the casing, take both of your ends, overlap them by about 1 inch, and then zigzag stitch all the way across them multiple times, like let's say 3 to 4 times to reinforce it. Your final step is to just sew down that 1-inch gap you had in the waistband casing, and then once you do that, you're ready to wear your towel shorts.